hopefully we're going to be building on everything we've talked about since Sunday night to bring us up to tonight's lesson. And hopefully it will all come together and make more sense as we discuss 9 macroevolution myths still taught in public schools. Micah pointed out that in the flyer it said 8 myths. I have a number of other ones that I've taken out and put back in. I decided to put one back in today based on a comment from someone. Steve had mentioned it'll be number 7. And so we will cover that tonight. So, what are the 9 frauds we're going to talk about? All 9 of these are still taught in public schools. Animal homology, embryology, the peppered moth, alleged horse evolution, Darwin's finches, Neanderthal man, and the one I added was Lucy, or Australopithecus afarensis, our ancestor, alleged fruit fly evolution, and vestigial organs. And the emphasis is going to be on the fact that evolution requires new genes, new information in the DNA. Now we know that there is some dishonesty, so we shouldn't be surprised. But Christians have to be different. 2 Corinthians 4:2 says, "But we have renounced the hidden things of shame, not walking in craftiness, nor handling the word of God deceitfully, but by manifestation of the truth, commending ourselves to every man's conscience in the sight of God." And as the brother prayed in the prayer tonight, we must make sure that we do it with proper attitude. As we mentioned a number of passages this week, 1 Peter 3:15, yet with meekness, with gentleness, Galatians 6:1, with gentleness, with kindness. Now, it's no surprise that there are frauds taught in school about evolution. These go back all the way to 1859 when Charles Darwin wrote his first book. Just to give you an example of a historic fraud that has been taught in schools was the 1912 so-called Piltdown Man. And to set the stage, what happened with Piltdown Man was when Charles Darwin published his second book in 1871, The Descent of Man, that said we evolved from apes. Many of the clergy challenged the evolutionists and said, well, we don't see that in the fossil record. Where can you prove that in the fossil record? They said that for 40 years. And if they weren't going to find an ancestor to man, then they were going to invent one. A man by the name of Charles Dawson in England, an amateur fossil hunter, said he found this jawbone and pieces of a skull in an abandoned rock quarry in southern England, in Piltdown. That's why it was called the Piltdown Man. For 40 years, children were paraded before these in a museum in London. And actually what they did after they examined the jawbone and the pieces of the skull, they made plaster casts of these, put them in the museum, and showed them for 40 years, but locked away the original artifacts and didn't let anyone see them. 40 years later, in the 1950s, they re-examined those. They opened the vault, and as soon as they saw them, immediately they knew that it was a fake. It was actually an orangutan jaw and pieces of a human skull, and it was clear just from the naked eye that the teeth had been filed down. There were file marks on the teeth, and it had been stained to make it look older. This became known, as it is in Reader's Digest in 1956, as the Great Piltdown Hoax. But not only that, there were many others going way back. In 1891, they proclaimed Java Man, which was actually the skull cap, 3 teeth, and a femur of a human. In 1892, Orsay Man. Then they found out it was just the skull of a donkey. In 1922, Nebraska Man. Then they discovered it was only the tooth of a pig. And then the hypothesis that life arose from non-life is still taught as a fact in public school, and we have addressed that. But we shouldn't be surprised by the deceit, should we? As we said last night, the Bible tells us there will be deceivers. who peddle lies and propaganda to supplant the truth. Paul warns about that in Colossians 2:8, where he says, "Beware lest anyone cheat you through philosophy and empty deceit, according to the tradition of men, according to the basic principles of the world, and not according to Christ." Well, let's get into the 9 frauds that we'll discuss that are still taught in public school. The first is animal homology. Really, similarities in animals. In college, they call it comparative anatomy. And the story goes like this. Because there are similarities in the organs and in the bones of different animals, we must have all descended from a common ancestor. For example, notice the forearm in the human. You can see analogous or homologous bones in all these other animals. You can see the human scapula here, or shoulder blade. Then the humerus, radius with ulna, phalanges, metacarpals, and carpals. We see similar features in all these other animals. Now, does this mean we all came from the same ancestor? Well, it could mean we all came from a common designer. For example, as you look at these vehicles, the 1953 to the 1984 Corvette, do you see similarities in these? Yes, it's quite different between the first one and the last one, but there are similarities. Why? Because they have a common designer, known as GM. It doesn't mean they evolved from the same ancestor. Well, next, what would discredit the Darwinian evolutionary model of homology? This would. Similar structures that appear in different evolutionary lines. That means animals that did not evolve from one another, but God put the same organ in different animals. Do we see that? We see that many times in nature. In fact, we see it in the vertebrata, or the vertebrates, or the chordates, animals with backbones, and the mollusks. Now, supposedly, these animals diverged hundreds of millions of years ago. And yet they accidentally evolved the same feature. And what was that? The eye. Their eyes both have an eyelid, cornea, pupil, iris, ciliary muscle, lens, retina, optic nerve, and optic ganglion. Structurally, they are identical. So you have one at the bottom of the ocean and one flying and walking on the moon. And supposedly they didn't evolve from one another. They just accidentally evolved the same organs. They give this a code name. They call it convergent evolution. We know that, but that's convergent evolution. What does convergent evolution mean? They accidentally evolved the same features. Now, to believe that one animal evolved the eye in the first place is simply imagination, but to believe that two animals evolved the exact same features, unbelievable. A second thing, if similarities indicate common ancestry, what should we find that shows that they were all coded the same? If they came from the same ancestor, they should be all coded the same. We should find homologous genes in their DNA or blueprints. Do we find them? No. And to set up this quote from Dr. Gavin DeVere in 1971, remember, and I've used this quote before, and he talks about genes in 1938. And people say, and someone said to me, well, we didn't know about DNA in 1938. Well, that's true. We didn't know about DNA. We didn't know about the double helix. We didn't know about the codons in DNA. But we did know, remember last night, we did know about genes from the creationist Gregor Mendel, who established gene theory. So we knew that genes were the mechanism of inheritance. Notice what Dr. DeVere says. What mechanisms can it be that result in the production of homologous organs, the same patterns, in spite of their not being controlled by the same genes? I asked this question in 1938, and it has not been answered. And it has not been answered today, except for the fact that we know they have the same structures, but they don't have the same genes, because they have a common designer. God decided to put the eye in the octopus and the same eye in the human, and used different genes. So take-home message for point number 1, similarities suggest a common designer rather than a common ancestor. Number 2, embryology, or Haeckel's embryos. Somebody was asking me about this last night, and I said, we'll cover Haeckel's embryos tonight. So the idea of embryology is, it's taught that animals recapitulate or go through evolution during the embryological developmental process. Once, at one point in our development, and as an embryo, we might look like a tadpole, and then maybe like a salamander, and then maybe like a lizard, is what they teach children. In fact, in this very popular textbook, biology textbook, they even call these pharyngeal folds. They're just folds in the skin. In embryos, they call them gill slits. Pure fiction. Well, to cover and go back to why it's called Haeckel's embryos, in 1874, there was a German evolutionist, biologist. His name was Ernst Haeckel. Ernst Haeckel was known as the apostle of Darwin in Germany. This was at a time when they would have you believe today that everyone accepted evolution. No, probably less than 1% of the population. It was only the elite academics and atheists that accepted it. Well, Haeckel tried to convince the German people of evolution, and they weren't buying it. So if they weren't going to buy it, he was going to invent a story. So what he did is made these wood carvings. And he showed that in the first stage of the embryological development, all the embryos pretty much look the same, don't they? And he showed, see, in the last stage, the fish, the hog, and the human, they all look different. And he said that proved we all came from a common ancestor. Well, number one, that's just a story. That doesn't prove anything. But number two, it was later demonstrated that he had faked these drawings. Here is what his actual drawings look like, the fish all the way up to the human. You want to see what the actual embryos look like? This is what the actual embryos look like. He faked the drawings to try to pull the wool over the eyes of the public, and he was actually tried by a group of his peers at the university and found to be fraudulent. Stephen Jay Gould even discusses this, famous evolutionist and atheist. He said Haeckel exaggerated the similarities in a procedure that can only be called fraudulent. We do, I think, have the right to be both astonished and ashamed by the century of mindless recycling that has led to the persistence of these drawings in a large number, if not a majority, of modern textbooks. I was at a learning fair, a school learning fair recently, and this one student was highlighting Ernst Haeckel, and he had his embryos up there demonstrating the evolution. This has been disproven since the 1800s. Well, in the year 2000, Dr. Michael Richardson from the Netherlands, he and a group of scientists went back to research and study all these embryos to see if it was true or false. And this is what he published in the very esteemed journal Science. It looks like it's turning out to be one of the most famous fakes in biology. So the question then, why is it still taught in public schools? I'll give you the same answer we've given all week, because they don't have anything better. Take-home message, Darwinists even admit that Haeckel's embryos are frauds. Embryology proves nothing about our origin. Number three is the English peppered moth. This is one that's still taught. In fact, Eugenie Scott said this is the best example that can be used to teach students. Now let's just remind you what is taught about the mechanism of evolution in school is based on two things: random mutations, error in the DNA, and natural selection, or the mutant offspring can leave more offspring than the wild type. So going back to the English peppered moth, what was the mutation and leaving more offspring? Well, as the story went, in England, there are two variants of the peppered moth. The same species. There's a light-colored variant, as you see here, and a dark-colored variant. Well, what happened in the early 1900s, the light-colored variant started disappearing, and the dark-colored variant predominated. So a man by the name of Bernard Kettlewell invented a story. He said, well, because of the industrialization in large cities in England and the large amount of soot and pollution they put out, it would darken the trees and kill the light-colored lichen, and therefore the birds could see the light-colored moths, and all of them got eaten, and so only the dark-colored moths were left. I presented this to our high school class at church recently, and my daughter was like, what does that prove? Well, it just proves microevolution, or loss of certain characteristics. First of all, it only proves variation within a kind. It doesn't prove evolution. And this is the key, again, as we said in the beginning, no new genetic information is being added. Even though they've taught this to students, even today in this country, they have not proven that any new information or genes were added. Well, what should you ask your teacher about the peppered moth? This is what you should ask them. So if the peppered moth demonstrates macroevolution, what new genes have been added to the moth genome? Well, we've known this for decades. Dr. L. Harrison Matthews, who was honored to write the foreword of Darwin's Origin of Species, said the following: the peppered moth experiments show survival of the fittest, but they do not show evolution and progress. If that was taught 53 years ago by one of the top biologists in the world, then why is it still taught in schools today? Because they don't have anything better. Even Jerry Coyne, who's a very rabid anti-creationist and evolutionist, he said these examples of peppered moth represent the loss of traits rather than the origin of evolutionary novelties. He says this is devolution. They're losing things. They're not gaining anything. And there are many other points we could make on this, but I'll just point out number D here. The photographs, later it was proved, were staged. Bernard Kettlewell staged and faked these photographs. He actually had to take cage-bred moths and warm them on the hood of his car in order to make them look lifelike. Then he anesthetized them and pinned or glued them to trees so he could video them or record them with film. And another evolutionist said in 40 years we've only found one instance where birds actually eat these off of trees. But as you see, the peppered moths don't even live on the sides of trees. They only come out at night and they live high underneath the branches of trees. The whole thing is a fake, and yet it's still taught in schools today. Why is it still used in textbooks? Notice this: the Denver Museum of Nature and Science even says this, how evolution works. It says that mutations introduce new characteristics and point out the peppered moth as an example. There's no mutations here. It's just a variant. That would be akin to saying a dark-skinned person and a white-skinned person, one of them is actually mutated. See how far that flies in today's woke culture. Here is a national curriculum for high school teachers from the National Science Teachers Association, and it tells them to use the peppered moth to show them the link, evolution's link to development. So the take-home message: the peppered moth demonstrates microevolution and not macroevolution. Number 4, alleged horse evolution. When I was at the University of Georgia, a friend of mine was a staunch evolutionist, still a good friend of mine. And so one day I asked her, I said, what do you think is the best proof of evolution? And without missing a beat, she told me immediately. She said, well, of course, the horse evolution. We see the little horses evolving to the big horses in the textbooks. Well, does that prove evolution? There's a number of things wrong with this. We'll just point out the major things. First of all, evolutionists admit that all but the little horse, Hyracotherium, also known as Eohippus or the dawn horse, that all the other horses, all these other four horses were contemporaneous to one another. They all lived at the same time. There's one area in this country where you can find all four horses in the same dig. If they all lived at the same time, then they did not evolve from one another. But we've known this. Notice 31 years ago, even though this is still taught in school today, 31 years ago, two of the greatest evolutionists in the country, Stephen Jay Gould at Harvard and Niles Eldredge at Columbia, as well as the American Museum of Natural History, said throughout the history of horses, the species are well marked and static over millions of years. That means they didn't change. The gradualistic picture of horse evolution becomes a complex bush of overlapping, closely related species. They say they did not evolve from one another. We can go back further. Dr. Stephen Stanley, 38 years ago at Johns Hopkins, said the horse is the classic story of one genus turning into another. Now it's becoming apparent that there's an overlap of these genera. There isn't just a simple gradual transition from one horse to another. We've known that for 38 years. Actually, we can go back further, 70 years. Dr. N.H. Nielsen at the University of Lund in Sweden said the family tree of the horse is beautiful and continuous only in the textbooks. The construction of the horse is therefore a very artificial one and cannot therefore be a continuous transformation series. They did not evolve from one another. But we can go back further. 71 years ago. Do you remember George Gaylord Simpson? He was one of the 7 architects of the modern synthesis or neo-Darwinism in the 1940s. Even he said the uniform continuous transformation of Hyracotherium into Equus, that is the dawn horse or the little horse, into the horse that we have today, so dear to the hearts of generations of textbook writers, never happened in nature. He said that 70 years ago, and yet they still put it in textbooks today. Why? Because they don't have any better examples. Take-home message, horse evolution never occurred. Next, this brings us, point 5, to Darwin's finches. This is another one of the most popular ones. As the story goes, as we mentioned earlier this week, in 1831, Charles Darwin was the naturalist aboard the HMS Beagle, traveling around the world, looking at a lot of geological and biological observations. And they went around South America and came up on the Galapagos Islands here. This is a series of about 24 islands off the coast of Costa Rica. Now on these islands he discovered 9 species of finch on the Galapagos. And you can see many of these here. And what he concluded is that all these finches must have come from a common ancestor. The finch that was on the land, South American finch. And here's his original drawings. Well, what did this prove? This only proves variation within a kind. No new genes have been added. We showed earlier this week there's different types of animals, different varieties of animals, but they're still the same kind. What's the point? There's fewer differences in Darwin's 9 finches than there are in the 360 dog breeds in the world. And yet evolutionists say these dog breeds are all the same species. They're not evolving into anything else. What's really going on here? No new genetic information is being added. Information is actually being lost. It's devolution. You could take the Chihuahua and the Great Dane, and you could breed a wolf ancestor, a wolf-like creature, down into one of these over a series of 100 years of selective breeding, but you can never breed them back because they've lost the genes, they've lost the genetic information. So what should you ask your teacher about Darwin's finches? Ask them, if Darwin's finches demonstrate macroevolution, what new genes have been added to the finch genome? Remember, neo-Darwinism is based on genetic variation and mutations. There has to be new genes that come about by mutations. Take-home message, Darwin's finches demonstrate microevolution and not macroevolution. Point 6, were the Neanderthal humans, or were they unevolved ape-like creatures? Now, going back 100, 150 years ago, we were told that Neanderthals were our ancestors. Well, they've since changed that and said, well, they weren't our ancestors. They just evolved down a different line than us. But it still demonstrates evolution. Well, what's the difference in Neanderthals and human if you look at them structurally? The only difference really is they have larger bones and a larger skull capacity. In fact, they had bigger brains on average than we do. If anything, they would be considered more evolved, not less evolved. But I'm going to give you a number of clues that Neanderthals were 100% human. Neanderthal people were known to have the following: created and hunted with weapons, created and admired artwork. It's proven that they actually set broken bones. They created musical instruments. We found them. They made and used tools and jewelry. They built and rode in ocean-sailing vessels. They observed religious practices. They worshiped God. They buried their dead with honors. They spoke an intelligible language. Does that sound like an unevolved, ape-like creature to you? They cultivated and used pigments. They cooked even their vegetables, which is supposed to be shown to be a higher form of intelligence. And even since the 1950s, this is a big warning, secular scientists have admitted that their anatomy falls into the range of human beings today, even their cranial capacity. I've got some pictures I didn't include, but there are humans today on different continents that have cranial capacities the same size as Neanderthals, as well as ridgebrows. They are just as large as Neanderthals. And finally, secular scientists admit that they lived the same times as humans. They walked like humans. They acted like humans. And notice this, they even interbred with humans. They've sequenced their DNA. I was at Michigan State University working recently and talking to some students, and somehow this idea of sequencing DNA and sending it in and determining your heritage came out in conversation. And one of the students there mentioned her background and all the cultures that were in her DNA. And she said, and it even said I had 1% Neanderthal. And so that opened up a conversation. I mentioned it to her. And many people in the world today, thousands of people, have Neanderthal DNA in their genome. Why? Because they were not humans, right? No. These were humans. Take-home message, Neanderthals were humans. Here's the one I added, was Lucy our ancestor? So when you talk about the ancestor of man, the most commonly used example is Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis. They say that this was our ancestor because she walked upright, bipedal, and there were some other features that were similar to humans, so we must have evolved from Lucy. It's in all the textbooks today. You can even see teaching on the internet, early humans for kids, lesson plans and resources. And here's one of them, the first humans. Hominids are the family of mankind and his or her relatives. And then it says, how do scientists know about an early man who lived 3 million years ago? Lucy told them. We evolved from Lucy, they said. Well, I'm going to give you a couple reasons why Lucy is not our ancestor. First of all, Lucy, they say, supposedly lived 3.7 million years ago. But did you know in 1976, the famous paleontologist Mary Leakey found these footprints in Africa, in Tanzania. These are called the Laetoli human footprints. they are in the same layer of sediment as Lucy was found. Okay? Humans were not supposed to have appeared until the last 100 to 200,000 years. Then what were human footprints doing 3.7 million years ago? Even PBS said the footprints also look remarkably like a human's. In fact, they look so human-like, some scientists had a hard time believing that they were made by Australopithecus afarensis, Lucy species, the only human ancestor known to have lived at the time. Well, we can prove that Lucy did not make these because she was not bipedal. She did not walk simply on 2 feet. But first, let's quote from another couple other individuals. We've known since 1989 in the Journal of Physical Anthropology that these footprints are indistinguishable from habitually barefoot Homo sapiens. These are human footprints. And on the right is a comparison between a human footprint and Lucy's footprint. Which do you think it most resembles? Also, human fossil footprints have been found in rocks that are supposedly millions of years old before humans were supposed to have evolved. These footprints are found all around the world: Africa, Texas, New Mexico, Turkey, Hawaii, Italy, and France. And in the journal Science in 1989, they even said the uneroded footprints show a total pattern like seen in modern humans. But another problem is that Lucy was not bipedal. She did not stand up and walk like humans. They say that is the major proof that she was our ancestor, that she walked on 2 feet. Well, this is the journal Nature in 2000, and it says new evidence has come forth that Lucy has the morphology of a knuckle walker. Her hands drop down here to the level of her ankles. She walked on her knuckles. And then this is a more recent article in 2012 in Science magazine, and it says that Lucy development was ape-like. And it goes on to say that her development was also not like human, it was like an ape. Lucy is not our ancestor. She was 100% ape. One individual, one evolutionist even says she's almost identical to modern pygmy chimps. 100% ape. So take-home message, evolutionists even admit Lucy is not our ancestor. Point number 8 out of 9 is fruit fly evolution. This is another popular one. So when I was in 7th grade, we were taught this, and we were given fruit flies and different mutagenic chemicals to mutate them. And we mutated them and changed all types of morphological, phenotypic characteristics. We changed their antennae, their wings, their abdomen, their thorax, their legs, and their eyes. And remember, as we said earlier, that evolution has to come from mutations in the DNA and natural selection. Well, does this prove evolution? Well, they like to point to the four-winged fruit fly. This is a favorite mutation that people like to breed or select for, mutate for. And they say, see, that's evolution in progress. A four-winged fruit fly. Isn't that clearly evolution? Well, there's a number of problems with this. And I like to call this the PBS principle. In order for evolution to be true, you have to establish the PBS principle. And that's easy to remember because they teach evolution on PBS. Well, PBS stands for, first, the mutations must be persistent. P, persistent. That is, they have to be passed down from generation to generation. Well, does the four-winged fruit fly pass down this mutation to the next generation? No. Why? Because it can't even breed. It's unable to breed. So it's not persistent. Well, is it beneficial? B. No, because the four-winged fruit fly cannot even fly. Finally, is it S, structural? Yes, it is structural. But if it can't pass down its genes and it can't be benefited by surviving in nature, then it cannot lead to evolution. Well, this is what you should ask your teacher about fruit fly evolution. If fruit fly mutations demonstrate macroevolution, what new beneficial genes have been added to the fruit fly genome? None. Then why do they still teach it in school? Because they don't have anything better to teach. Take-home message: fruit fly mutations demonstrate microevolution and not macroevolution. This brings us to point 9, our final point tonight. Vestigial organs. I know one member of the church, he's actually a professor, and he said he quit even teaching this in his evolution lectures, creation lectures, because it's just so bogus, so patently false, and so easy to disprove. Well, I still do include it. Why? Because it's still taught in schools every day in this country. I was taught about vestigial organs. What are vestigial organs? Vestigial comes from the word vestige, which means something from the past, and they say it's not needed anymore. So we have all these organs, they say, that are leftover evolutionary vestiges. These include things, the common suspects are the tonsils, the tailbone, a coccyx, and the appendix. I was taught all this in school, as many of you probably were as well. In fact, in 1931, the German evolutionary scientist Alfred Wiedersheim, in a book entitled The Science of Life, listed 180 useless vestigial organs in the human body alone. You know what? They've all been proven to be useful, all 180 of them. Many of these are pointed out in Dr. Bergman and Howe's book, Vestigial Organs Are Fully Functional. But did you know we could go back 43 years ago? This is 1981. This is the year I finished kindergarten. Even though I finished kindergarten in 1981, all throughout the rest of my middle school, high school, and college career, they still taught vestigial organs. But notice what was said in the journal Evolutionary Theory in 1981, 43 years ago. Vestigial organs provide no evidence for evolutionary theory. But 27 years ago, after that, the Encyclopedia Britannica still said the appendix does not serve any useful purpose as a digestive organ in humans, and it is believed to be gradually disappearing in the human species over evolutionary time. This is still taught in public schools. Well, let's look at a few of these. First, the appendix. Well, we can go back 34 years ago. In the textbook, Clinically Oriented Anatomy, college textbook, Dr. Keith Moore describes the appendix as a well-developed lymphoid organ. In fact, it's shown to be part of the lymph system. They believe that it's a pocket that stores, some scientists believe that it stores bacteria, so when you have dysentery and all your good bacteria is flushed out, it will store as a safe house some of these bacteria to repopulate. I've also seen where they believe that it's very instrumental in the development of infants, that it helps the infants develop their microbiome in their gut. But we can go back further. 48 years ago, in the journal Gastroenterology, Dr. G. McHardy said, the appendix is not generally credited with significant function. However, current evidence tends to involve it in the immunologic mechanism. We knew that 48 years ago, yet it's still taught to be in a vestigial organ in schools today. Next, the tonsils. We can just go to Wikipedia to disprove this. After all, everything Wikipedia says is true, right? Not necessarily, but they do have this right. Wikipedia in 2008 said, like other organs of the lymphatic system, the tonsils act as part of the immune system to help protect against infection. In particular, they are believed to be involved in helping fight off pharyngeal and upper respiratory tract infections. The tonsils are part of our immune system. Next is the coccyx. I like this comic. This is a chick track. I don't know if you've seen chick tracks, but this is one about evolution. And throughout this comic track, the student is sparring with his professor about evolution. And the professor says vestigial organs like the human tailbone prove we evolved from animals with tails. And the student says, sir, there are 9 muscles attached to the tailbone. It is not vestigial. It's been shown that the tailbone is actually instrumental in helping hold up the pelvic girdle with all the muscles in there. Without the tailbone, you wouldn't be able to hold up your insides. Next, the wings of flightless birds. This is commonly used. They'll say, see, the ostrich, the emu, the rhea, they have wings, but they don't fly. That's because these wings aren't needed. They're vestiges of the past. Well, we know a number of reasons that they need these wings. They're used in balance when running. They're used in balance when breeding. They have to have them to procreate. They're used to protect their young. They're used to balance, as we said, when running. And they're used to protect them in a fall. They're not vestigial. Number 5, supposed hip bones in whales. Another common one, the last place I lectured, someone wanted to talk to me about this because he was being taught this in school. Well, that one's also easy to disprove. They say these are supposed hip bones when whales were mammals that used to walk on land. Then they went back into the ocean. They actually said originally the animals were in the ocean, they came up on land, evolved on the land, then they evolved back into the ocean, and this is where they had rear legs, and they still have the hip bones, but no legs. Well, it's been proven that these hip bones are used in breeding, in reproducing. They wouldn't be able to procreate without these. These are not vestigial. So what should you ask your teacher finally about vestigial organs? Ask them if vestigial organs demonstrate macroevolution, what new genes have been added to the animal's genome. It's a loss of characteristics. It's devolution and not evolution. Well, as we said in the beginning, proponents of naturalistic Darwinism are not always honest in their dealings. In fact, listen to Dr. Henry Lipson. He was head of the Department of Physics at the University of Manchester. He said, in fact, evolution has become, in a sense, a scientific religion. And almost all scientists have accepted it, and many are prepared to bend their observations to fit with it. I just say that to say, don't be discouraged and don't be surprised when you see this taught in school, on the Discovery Channel, the Learning Channel, the History Channel, National Geographic Channel. This is the world. This is what we should expect of the world. Just be prepared, as 1 Peter 3:15 says, to give a defense. As 2 Peter 2 and verse 1 says, there were also false prophets among the people, even as there will be false teachers among you, who will secretly bring in destructive heresies, even denying the Lord who bought them, and bring on themselves swift destruction. And many will follow their destructive ways, because of whom the way of the truth will be blasphemed. If anything, we shouldn't be frustrated, discouraged, or angry. We should be disappointed and feel sorry for these individuals, because one day they will stand before the Creator of all things. And I'm going to conclude by giving you what some people call the intelligent design verse of the Bible. Romans 1:20, for since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. We can look in the world and see that God made it. Even His eternal power in Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Again, bookmark these recommended websites. Take a copy of the recommended reading list that has all these websites and bookmark them on your computer. If you have any questions, feel free to approach me. But these websites, especially the first one, creation.com,
has many more answers than I would be able to provide, as many creation scientists, as I have heard on creation.com, many of these articles written by PhD scientists, that some of them actually have to write under pseudonyms so that they will not lose their job in the university. In fact, I know professors around this country that believe intelligent design, but do so secretly for fear of losing their jobs also. Well, let's conclude with an invitation and invite you to come to the Lord, to be baptized in Him if you haven't. Let's review what verses we've covered this week. We've covered a number of verses about baptism. It's pretty clear that we have to be baptized to be put into Christ. Galatians 3:27, those who have been baptized into Christ have put on Christ. Acts 2:38, baptism saves us. Repent and be baptized in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of your sins. 1 Peter 3:21 says that baptism does even also now save you. Acts 8:36 through 39, when Philip preached Jesus to the eunuch, they went down into the water and came up out of the water, and the eunuch went on his way rejoicing. And then last night we mentioned 1 Corinthians 12, around verses 12 through 14, where when we're baptized into the church. And those are the saved, those in the church. Tonight let's look at one more passage in Colossians chapter 2. If you turn over to Colossians 2, and down around verse 12, we see that he's using the analogy here, Paul is, to discuss the circumcision under the old law. Now, under the old law, the circumcision was the binding part of the covenant. Is what put them in covenant with God. And he says we have a circumcision today. In verse 11 of Colossians 2, and in him you were circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, in the removal of the body of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ. Well, how do we receive the circumcision of Christ? Verse 12, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised up with him through faith in the working of God, who raised him from the dead. Just as Israel was made part of that kingdom and that covenant with God through circumcision, today you can be part of God's kingdom by being baptized, being circumcised in the heart, circumcised in the spirit, after you were baptized in Christ. If you'd like to be baptized, we invite you to come as we stand and sing the hymn.